The
You shouldn't
tracks
have come.
didn't belong to a woman, Ethan Cole said
I had
under
to
his
see for
breath,
myself.
crouching in the cold dirt. And they sure as hell weren't made by someone afraid. The wind had died an hour ago, leaving the woods too still, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's ears until he started hearing things that weren't there. And yet Ethan trusted what he could see more than what he could hear. Always had. Ever since his days riding ahead of cavalry lines where one wrong read in the dust could cost a man his life. The prints in front of him started light, narrow, the kind left by a woman walking alone in worn boots, careful steps, heel barely pressing. Like she was used to being unnoticed, but 10 yards ahead, something changed. The impressions sank deeper, straighter. Each step measured the same distance apart, not wandering, not hesitating, just moving forward with purpose, like a soldier keeping pace in formation. He lifted his gaze slowly, scanning the dark tree line where the last of the evening light slipped through branches like thin blades. And there she was, Clara Whitlock, just a shadow between shadows, moving without looking back. Her coat brushing against the tall grass with a soft whisper that carried farther than it should have. People in town said she kept to herself, said she didn't bother anyone, said a lot of things that didn't add up. But Ethan had seen enough men lie to know when a story was built to keep others from asking questions. And Clara's story had too many clean edges. She had come into town 6 months ago with nothing but a small trunk and a name no one recognized, bought a piece of land near the woods, and never once asked for help. Not when the roof needed fixing, not when winter winds cut through the valley like knives, not even when supplies ran low and most folks would have traded pride for survival. That wasn't stubbornness, that was training. Ethan shifted his weight, careful not to snap a twig beneath his boot, and followed at a distance of 20 yards, just far enough to stay out of sight, just close enough to keep her in view, his hand resting near his belt out of habit more than fear, because something about the way she moved told him this wasn't a woman wandering into the woods for quiet or solitude. This was someone going somewhere specific. The ground sloped downward, soft with layers of fallen leaves that muffled his steps, and the air carried a faint scent of ash, not fresh smoke, but something older, something that had burned and been covered over, like a secret buried just beneath the surface. Clara didn't slow, didn't pause, didn't once look over her shoulder, and that bothered Ethan more than anything else. Because everyone looked back when they felt watched, everyone except those who already knew they were. When she reached a narrow gap between two large stones, barely wide enough for a person to pass, she slipped through without breaking stride, disappearing from view in a way that felt too clean, too practiced. And when Ethan reached the same spot seconds later, his pulse steady but his mind turning sharp, he stopped, staring at the ground where her tracks should have continued, but didn't. The lighter prints ended right there, as if she had stepped out of her own skin, and in their place were deeper marks, heavier, the stride longer, the pressure different, the kind left by someone carrying weight not on their back, but in the way they held themselves. Ethan crouched again, brushing his fingers over the dirt, feeling the firmness of the impression, the precision of it, and a quiet realization settled in his chest, slow and certain, like the moment before a storm breaks over open land. Clara Whitlock wasn't hiding from the world out of fear. She was hiding because if the world saw her clearly, it wouldn't know what to do with the truth. Ethan did not move for a full 10 seconds, not because he was afraid, but because every instinct he had learned over the years told him that rushing now would cost him the truth. And truth was the only thing he trusted more than a loaded revolver. The deeper tracks led forward into a narrow passage between stone walls that rose higher than a man on horseback, cutting off the last of the fading light and swallowing sound until even his own breathing felt too loud. So he slowed it, steady and quiet, the way he had been taught long before he ever wore a badge or followed orders. Back when reading the land was the difference between getting home and disappearing without a trace. Each step he took matched the rhythm of the prints ahead of him. Long, even strides, no hesitation, no wasted movement. And that bothered him more than anything. Because people who were hiding made mistakes. They stumbled. They doubled back. They left confusion behind them. But whoever had made these tracks moved like someone who knew exactly who they were. And exactly where they were going. The passage opened just enough for him to see a faint glow ahead. Not firelight. Not quite. Something softer, steadier, like lanterns shielded from the wind, and with it came voices, low and controlled, not the careless talk of men at ease, but the measured tone of people who chose every word before letting it out. Ethan dropped to one knee, resting his hand against the cool rock, and leaned just far enough to look without being seen, his eyes adjusting to the dim light until shapes formed out of shadow. 3 men at first, then 5, all standing in a loose line, rifles slung but not ready, their posture straight, alert, waiting. And at the center of them stood Clara, or at least the woman he had known as Clara. But something about her was different now. The way she held her shoulders, the angle of her chin, the stillness in her stance. It was not the quiet caution of someone avoiding attention. It was the controlled calm of someone used to being. The one others watched. One of the men spoke, his voice careful, asking something Ethan could not quite make out, and Clara answered, her tone lower than he had ever heard it before, steady, precise, carrying authority without effort, and the men listened, not interrupting, not questioning, just listening. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not fear, not yet, but the slow recognition that the story he had accepted about her was not just incomplete, it was wrong. His gaze dropped for a moment, scanning the ground near the entrance of the clearing, and that was when he saw it, half buried in the dirt, catching the faint light just enough to draw his attention, a small piece of metal no larger than his palm, and without thinking he reached for it, his fingers brushing away the soil until the shape became clear, a badge, worn at the edges but unmistakable, stamped with the mark of the United States Cavalry, the kind issued to officers who had earned their place through discipline and years of service. Ethan turned it slightly in his hand, the cold metal pressing into his skin, and a single thought settled in his mind, heavy and certain, because he had seen this kind of badge before, had tracked men who wore them, had worked alongside some and buried others. And there was one thing he knew for sure. They did not just disappear and become someone else. He lifted his eyes back toward Clara, toward the woman giving quiet orders in a place no one in town even knew existed. And for the first time since he started following her, Ethan Cole realized that he was not uncovering a secret. He was stepping into something that had been carefully built long before he ever noticed her, something that had rules he did not understand yet. And as if she could feel the weight of that realization, Clara turned her head slightly, not enough to reveal her face, but enough for her gaze to pass over the shadows where he knelt. And though she said nothing, Ethan knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that she was no longer unaware of him, and whatever came next would not be an accident. Clara did not turn fully, not at first, but the slight pause in her posture was enough to silence the men around her, and Ethan felt it immediately, the shift in the air, like the moment before a storm when everything holds its breath. She lifted one hand, not in alarm, not in warning, but in quiet command, and every man in that clearing stilled without question, their eyes moving not to the trees, not to the shadows, but to her. Waiting, Ethan stayed where he was, crouched low against the stone, the badge still cold in his palm, his mind running through every possibility and discarding each one just as quickly, because none of them fit what he was seeing. A woman who lived alone on the edge of town, did not gather armed men in hidden clearings, did not speak with the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed, did not carry the weight of a soldier in the way she stood. One of the men shifted his footing, glancing toward the darkness where Ethan hid, and for a moment it seemed like they might move, might search, might close in on the place where he knelt. But Clara lowered her hand slightly and gave a small shake of her head, and that was enough. The man stopped, the tension eased, and whatever question had formed in his mind disappeared without being spoken. Ethan exhaled slowly, careful, controlled, the way he had learned to do when he was closer to danger than he wanted to admit. But this did not feel like danger in the way he understood it. This felt like stepping into a story that had already begun without him. Clara took a step forward then, into the faint light, and for the first time Ethan saw her face clearly in this place. Not the guarded expression she wore in town, not the distant look she gave to strangers, but something sharper, something more certain, her eyes steady, her jaw set in a way that spoke of decisions made long before this night. She spoke again, quieter now, but every word carried, clear and measured. "We move before first light," she said. No delays, no questions. And the men nodded, not out of fear, but out of trust, the kind that was earned over time, not demanded. Ethan's grip tightened around the badge as her words settled in his mind. Because people who gave orders like that were not hiding from something small. They were preparing for something that mattered. The men began to disperse, not chaotically, not in haste, but with purpose, each one moving to a place they seemed to already know, leaving Clara alone in the center of the clearing. For a moment, she did not move. She simply stood there, listening, and Ethan had the uneasy sense that she was not listening to the woods, but to him. Then, without turning, she spoke, her voice no louder than before, but directed, precise, cutting through the distance between them as if it were nothing at all. "You have followed me far enough, Ethan Cole," she said, and the sound of his name in her voice landed heavier than any threat, because he had never given it to her, not in full, not in a way she should remember. Ethan did not reach for his gun, did not step back. He simply rose slowly from his crouch, the leaves beneath his boots barely making a sound, and stepped into the edge of the light, his eyes fixed on her, searching for something familiar in a face that no longer felt like the one he knew. Clara turned then, fully this time, and met his gaze without hesitation, without apology, and in that moment Ethan understood something he could not yet explain, that whatever truth stood in front of him had not been created to deceive him. It had been built to survive everything else. The badge in his hand felt heavier now, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant, and as the silence stretched between them, Clara's expression did not change. She did not defend herself, did not justify anything. She simply waited, as if the next move had never been hers to make. Ethan held her gaze, steady but not careless, the way a man looks at something he does not yet understand but knows better than to dismiss. And for a long second neither of them spoke, the clearing quiet again except for the faint shift of boots in the distance as the last of the men moved out of sight, leaving only the two of them and whatever truth had been waiting beneath the surface all along. He opened his hand slowly, letting the badge catch the dim light between them, not raising it like an accusation, not hiding it either, just placing it where it belonged, in the space between what he thought he knew and what he was beginning to see. Clara's eyes dropped to it for a fraction of a moment, and that was enough. Not shock, not fear, just recognition, the kind that comes when something long buried is suddenly brought back into the open air. Ethan spoke then, his voice low, controlled. "You want to tell me how a woman who keeps to herself ends up with something like this?" he said, turning the badge slightly. "Or do I keep guessing and get it wrong?" And there was no anger in his tone, only the quiet weight of a man who preferred truth over comfort. Clara did not answer right away. She stepped closer instead, not enough to threaten, not enough to retreat, just enough to make it clear she was not running anymore. And when she finally spoke, her voice had lost that distant softness she carried in town, replaced by something firmer, something that did not ask to be believed. "Names change," she said, "but what a person has done does not." And the words settled between them with a kind of finality that made Ethan's thoughts sharpen. He studied her face again, not as Clara Whitlock now, but as someone else, someone who had worn that badge, who had stood where orders were given and followed, someone who had chosen to step away from it all and disappear into a life that did not match the past she carried. "You were cavalry," he said, not as a question, but as a line drawn from the evidence in his hand to the truth in front of him, and Clara did not deny it, did not confirm it either. She only held his gaze, letting the silence answer in a way words never could. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the leaves beneath his boots whispering against the ground, his mind moving through what this meant, not just for her, but for the men he had seen, for the orders she had given, for the reason someone would trade a uniform for a hidden life in the woods. "They were waiting on you," he added, glancing briefly toward the path where the others had gone. That was not fear back there, that was trust. And this time Clara's expression changed, not much, just enough for him to catch it. A flicker of something that was not pride, not regret, but responsibility. She looked past him for a moment, toward the dark line of trees, as if measuring something he could not see, then back at him. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty that did not need to be raised. "If they find what I left behind," she said, "they will not ask who deserves it. they will decide. And there was no need to explain who they were. Ethan had heard enough stories, seen enough orders carried out in the name of something larger than the people it affected. The badge in his hand felt heavier now, not because of its metal, but because of the choice it represented. The line between turning away and stepping deeper into something that would not let him walk back out unchanged. Ethan closed his fingers around it slowly, not pocketing it yet, just holding it, and met her eyes again. The question no longer about what she was hiding, but why she had chosen to hide it this way. And as the silence settled once more, Clara did not step back, did not reach for anything. She simply waited, as if the truth had been placed in his hands along with that badge, and whatever came next would not be decided by her. Ethan did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than either of them expected, not empty, not uncertain, but heavy with the kind of weight that only comes when a man realizes he is no longer standing at the edge of something, but already inside it. He turned the badge once more between his fingers, feeling the worn edges press into his skin as if the metal itself carried memory. And he had seen men hold on to things like this before, not for pride, not for rank, but because letting go meant admitting something had ended that could never be repaired. "You walked away," he said finally, his voice low, not accusing, just stating what the evidence had already told him, and Clara did not deny it, did not flinch. She only nodded once, slow, deliberate, like someone who had made that choice long ago and never looked back. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his gaze drifting for a moment toward the dark path where the others had gone, and he could still see it in his mind. The way they had stood, the way they had listened, not like hired hands, not like outlaws, but like men who believed in the person giving the orders. "Those men," he continued, "they are not hiding from you." And Clara's eyes shifted slightly at that, just enough to show she understood what he meant. "They are standing with you." And this time she answered, her voice steady, "Because they know what happens if no one does." And there it was again. Not fear, not guilt, but something deeper, something tied to responsibility rather than escape. Ethan studied her for another long moment, trying to place the shape of her story into something that made sense, but it refused to fit into anything simple. And that was when he realized it was not supposed to. "You said they will decide," he said, bringing the words back. "Who are they?" And Clara's gaze moved past him again, toward the open land beyond the trees, as if the answer was not something that could be pointed to, only understood. "Men who do not see people," she said quietly. "Only lines on a map and orders on paper." And Ethan felt that settle deep, because he had known men like that, had ridden under some of them, had followed commands that made sense at the time and less sense the further he rode away from them. The night air shifted slightly, a faint breeze moving through the trees at last, carrying the scent of earth and ash with it. And for the first time since he stepped into the clearing, Ethan felt the stillness begin to loosen, as if whatever had been holding the moment in place was starting to move again. He closed his hand around the badge, tighter this time, and looked back at Clara, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone standing at the center of a choice he could not ignore. "And what happens when they come looking?" he asked, and the question was not about if. It was about when. Clara did not hesitate, did not look away. "Then I make sure they do not find what they are looking for," she said, and there was no threat in it, no defiance, just a quiet certainty that came from someone who had already decided how far they were willing to go. Ethan felt a faint pull in his chest then, not fear, not doubt, but recognition, the kind that comes when two people who have walked different paths realize they have been heading toward the same line all along. He slipped the badge into his pocket slowly, not hiding it, not displaying it, just placing it where it would stay for now. And that small movement carried more weight than anything he had said so far, because it was not about what he knew, it was about what he was choosing not to do with it. Clara watched him, her expression unchanged, but something in her stance eased, just slightly, like a door that had been closed for too long, finally opening a fraction of an inch. Neither of them spoke after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the next words would not come easy. And out here, in the quiet space between what was known and what was hidden, silence was sometimes the only honest answer a man could give. The wind came back slow, like the land itself had been holding its breath and finally decided to let go. and Ethan felt it brush against his coat as he stood there across from her. No longer hidden, no longer guessing, just present in a place he was never meant to find. Clara turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the narrow path that led deeper into the woods, and for a moment it seemed like she might leave without another word, like whatever had passed between them was enough. But she stopped after 2 steps, her back still to him, her voice quieter now, not distant, not guarded, but measured in a way that carried something heavier than before. "You should head back before the light's gone," she said, and it was not a dismissal, not quite, more like a line being drawn between what he had seen and what he was being allowed to carry with him. Ethan did not move, his eyes following the slight shift in her posture, the way her shoulders held steady even as everything around them began to move again. And he knew that if he turned now, if he walked away without asking what sat just beneath the surface of her words, he would spend the rest of his days wondering where that path had truly led. "You did not answer the part that matters," he said, his voice calm, not pushing, but not letting go either, and Clara paused again, the silence stretching just long enough to show that she had heard him clearly. "What part is that?" she asked without turning, and Ethan took a step forward, slow, deliberate, closing the distance by no more than a few feet, but enough to make his presence something she could not set aside. "Why you stayed," he said. "You had a way out. You could have kept going, changed your name again, gone somewhere no one would ever look, but you did not." And there was no accusation in it, only a question that carried weight because it did not fit the story of someone running. Clara let out a breath then, quiet but steady, and when she turned back toward him, there was something different in her eyes, not the guarded distance he had seen before, but something closer to honesty, the kind that only shows itself when there is nothing left to protect from being known. "Because they do not have one," she said, and Ethan felt the words land before he could even place them, because he already understood who she meant without needing her to explain. The men in the clearing, the ones who had stood without fear, without doubt, waiting for her to speak. She stepped closer again, this time closing the space between them to less than 10 feet, not challenging, not retreating, just meeting him in a place where neither of them had the advantage. "You think I am hiding," she continued, her voice even, "but I am the only thing between them and being found." And that shifted everything in Ethan's mind, because hiding meant escape, but this was something else entirely. He looked past her then, toward the dark line of trees where the others had gone, imagining the paths they would take, the places they would reach before dawn, the kind of movement that did not belong to people drifting without direction, but to those who had something worth protecting. "And if someone comes through that valley asking questions," he said slowly, "they will start in town." And Clara nodded once, not surprised, not concerned in the way he expected, just acknowledging what was already part of the reality she had accepted. "They always do," she said, and there was no fear in it, only a quiet understanding of how the world worked. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, the weight of his choice settling deeper now, because it was no longer about what he had found, it was about what would follow him back when he left this place. The questions, the looks, the expectations that came with being the man who noticed things others missed. He reached into his pocket then, not to pull the badge out, but to press it deeper inside, a small movement that said more than words ever could. And when he looked back at her, there was no uncertainty left in his gaze, only a steady resolve that matched her own. Clara saw it, and for the first time since he had followed her into the woods, something in her expression softened, not relief, not gratitude, just the smallest shift of understanding, like 2 people recognizing the same line drawn in the same place. Neither of them spoke after that, because there was nothing left that needed saying, only the quiet knowledge that whatever came next would not be decided in this clearing, but out there, where the land stretched wide and men made choices they could not take back. And as the last light slipped behind the trees, Ethan Cole understood that walking away from this place would not mean leaving it behind. The last light faded completely as Ethan stepped back from the clearing, not turning his back on Clara, not yet, because men who had learned to read danger did not abandon their sight until the moment was truly over, and even then, they carried it with them. She did not follow him, did not stop him either. She simply stood there, still as the trees around her, watching in a way that did not demand trust but seemed to measure it all the same, and Ethan understood that whatever had passed between them would not be spoken of again unless he chose to break it. He turned then, finally, moving toward the narrow passage between the stones, his boots finding the same quiet rhythm as before, but this time each step felt different, heavier, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing something that could not be easily set aside. The woods greeted him again with that low silence, but it no longer felt empty. It felt aware, like the land itself held more than it showed, and he wondered how many nights Clara had walked this path alone, carrying a name that was not hers, holding a line no one else could see. He reached the edge of the trees just as the first stars began to settle overhead, faint and scattered across the sky, and the open land beyond stretched out wide and familiar, the town lights barely visible in the distance, small and steady, as if nothing had changed, as if no hidden paths ran beneath its quiet edges. Ethan paused there for a moment, one foot on the dry grass, the other still in the shadow of the woods, and that line felt clearer than anything he had seen all night, because it was not just land he was stepping between, it was two versions of the same truth, one that could be spoken and one that could not. He moved forward slowly, leaving the trees behind, the sound of his steps growing louder on the open ground, and with each yard he put between himself and that hidden clearing, the world seemed to settle back into something ordinary, but his mind did not follow. It stayed behind, replaying the look in Clara's eyes, the steadiness in her voice, the way those men had stood without question. By the time he reached the dirt road leading into town, the night had fully taken hold, the air cooler now, carrying the distant scent of wood smoke and horses, the kind of familiar details that usually brought a man back to himself. But tonight they only sharpened the contrast, made the quiet lie of normal life feel thinner than it had before. A lantern burned low outside the general store, casting a soft circle of light onto the porch, and Ethan slowed his pace as he approached, not because he was tired, but because he knew what waited ahead, not in the buildings, not in the people, but in the questions that would come if he let them. Sheriff Nolan would ask where he had been, someone always did. And Ethan had never been a man who struggled to answer simple questions. But this was not simple anymore. He stopped just short of the light, his hand brushing against the pocket where the badge rested, feeling its shape through the fabric, a small, solid reminder of everything that had shifted. He thought about pulling it out, about holding it up under that lantern glow, about turning it into something official, something that could be explained and written down and passed along until it became someone else's responsibility. But the thought did not settle right. It never made it past the surface. Instead, he let his hand fall back to his side, his gaze lifting toward the quiet buildings, the closed doors, the lives inside that would go on unchanged by what he had seen. And for the first time since he had stepped into those woods, Ethan Cole understood that the hardest part was not finding the truth. It was deciding what to do with it once it was in your hands. And as he finally stepped into the lantern light, his face calm, his pace steady, no one looking at him would have known that somewhere beyond the trees, a different kind of order was already moving before dawn, and he had chosen to leave it that way. Morning came slow over the valley, not with color at first, but with a thin gray light that settled over rooftops and fences like dust, and Ethan Cole was already awake before it reached the windows, sitting at the edge of his bed with his boots on and his thoughts still somewhere between the trees and the road he had taken back. He had not slept much, not because he could not, but because there was nothing in his past that had prepared him for what it meant to carry a truth he had no intention of sharing, and that weight did not fade with rest, it settled deeper. Outside, the town moved like it always did, steady and predictable, the sound of a wagon rolling over hard ground, the low murmur of voices near the well, a dog barking once and then losing interest, and for anyone else, that might have been enough to bring the world back into place. But Ethan saw it differently now. Every familiar detail framed against something unseen just beyond the edge of it. He stepped out onto the porch, the early air cool against his face, and his eyes drifted toward the line of trees in the distance, dark and quiet under the rising light, giving nothing away. There was no sign of movement, no trace of what had passed there only hours before, and that was the point, he realized. Whatever Clara had built was not meant to be seen from the outside, not even by someone who knew where to look. A figure approached along the road, steady, unhurried, and Ethan recognized the posture before the face came into view. Sheriff Nolan, hat low, hands resting near his belt in that familiar way that suggested nothing was wrong and everything was being watched all the same. "You are up early," Nolan said as he reached the bottom of the steps, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp, taking in more than his words suggested, and Ethan gave a small nod, nothing more, because anything more might invite questions he was not ready to answer. "Did not sleep much," he replied, keeping his voice even, and Nolan studied him for a moment longer, as if weighing whether that answer was enough, before shifting his gaze toward the horizon. "We had riders pass through before dawn," the sheriff said, almost as an afterthought. "Did not stop, did not ask for anything. Just moved through like they knew exactly where they were headed." And Ethan felt that land inside him like a quiet echo, not surprise, not alarm, just confirmation. He kept his expression steady, his eyes following Nolan's toward the open land. "Out here, people always got somewhere to be," he said, and the words sounded simple enough, ordinary enough, but they carried more than they appeared to. Nolan gave a small nod, accepting it for what it was or choosing not to push further, and after a moment he tipped his hat and moved on, leaving Ethan alone again with the quiet of the morning. The town continued around him, unchanged, unaware, and Ethan remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against his coat pocket, feeling the shape of the badge still there, still real, a small piece of a life that had not disappeared so much as it had been set aside for something else. He looked once more toward the trees, the line where the known ended and the hidden began, and for the first time since stepping out of them, he understood that the truth did not need to be spoken to exist. It only needed someone willing to carry it without turning it into something smaller than it was. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting light across the land in long, quiet lines, Ethan Cole stood there without moving, knowing that somewhere beyond sight, Clara Whitlock was already gone again, not running, not hiding, but moving exactly where she needed to be, and that was enough. By mid-morning, the town had settled into its usual rhythm, the kind that made a man believe nothing ever truly changed out here. But Ethan Cole knew better now, because once you saw what moved beneath the surface, you could not unsee it, no matter how ordinary things looked. He spent the early hours moving through his routine without thinking, checking the fence line, tending to small repairs, letting his hands work while his mind stayed elsewhere, replaying the quiet certainty in Clara's voice, the way those men had stood without question, the way the badge in his pocket seemed to carry more weight with every step he took. It was near noon when the first sign came that something had shifted. Beyond the edge of town, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the kind of detail most people would miss, a rider approaching from the south road, alone, steady, not in a hurry, but not wandering either, and Ethan noticed the way the horse moved, well-trained, well-kept, the kind of animal that belonged to someone who expected discipline. The rider dismounted near the well, speaking briefly with a couple of townsfolk, his posture relaxed but his eyes scanning more than his words let on, and Ethan watched from a distance, leaning against the side of the general store, not hiding, not drawing attention, just present. It did not take long before the rider's gaze found him, not by accident, but with intention, and that was enough to confirm what Ethan already suspected. This was not a man passing through. This was someone looking. The rider approached at a measured pace, stopping a few feet away, his hat casting a shadow over his face that did not quite hide the sharpness in his expression. "You know this land well," the man said, not as a question, but as an opening, and Ethan gave a slight nod, keeping his tone even. "Well enough," he replied. The man studied him for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges from being handled too many times, and without unfolding it fully, he angled it just enough for Ethan to see the sketch inside. A face drawn in careful lines, familiar in a way that tightened something in his chest, because even without the details, even without the name beneath it, Ethan recognized her. He did not let it show, not in his eyes, not in the set of his shoulders, but the moment stretched just long enough for the rider to take notice of something. Maybe not the truth, but the possibility of it. She has been seen near here, the man continued, his voice calm, controlled, the kind that did not need to be raised to carry weight. And I am looking to confirm that. And there it was, not a demand, not yet, but a line being drawn in a different way than the one Ethan had crossed the night before. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, his hand brushing once more against the pocket where the badge rested, feeling its presence like a quiet reminder of the choice already made. And he met the man's gaze without hesitation. "A lot of people pass through these parts," he said, letting the words settle in a way that gave nothing and took nothing. "Most of them do not stay long enough to be remembered." And the rider watched him closely, weighing the answer, searching for something beneath it. But Ethan gave him nothing more. The man nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if filing the response away for later, then folded the paper and slipped it back into his coat. "If you do remember anything," he said, "it would be wise to share it." And there was no threat in the words, only a quiet certainty that made them heavier than they sounded. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. And as the rider turned and walked back toward his horse, the town continued around them. Unaware of the quiet line that had just been drawn in the open air, Ethan remained where he was, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. But inside, the path ahead had become clearer than it had been all morning, because whatever Clara had been preparing for, whatever she had built beyond those trees, it was no longer a question of if it would be tested, but when. And as the rider mounted and headed back the way he came, Ethan Cole understood that the truth he had chosen to carry was about to demand more from him than silence alone. The rider's silhouette disappeared into the shimmer of heat along the south road, but the space he left behind did not empty. It lingered, like a question that had already been asked and was now waiting for its answer, and Ethan Cole felt it settle into the town without anyone else noticing, the way a shift in the wind moves dust before a storm no one sees coming. He pushed himself off the post outside the general store and walked without hurry, not toward the sheriff's office, not toward the saloon, but past them, letting the rhythm of his steps match the steady pace of a man with nothing to hide. Because out here, the ones who hurried were the ones who drew eyes. Still, every detail sharpened, every voice carried a little further, every glance seemed to last a fraction longer than it should. And Ethan knew it was not the town that had changed, it was the line he now stood on. He turned down the narrow path behind the feed shed, a route few people used unless they had reason, and let the buildings fall away behind him until the sounds of town softened into something distant and unimportant, replaced by the low whisper of grass and the quiet stretch of open land. The tree line waited ahead, dark even under the high sun, and for a moment he stopped short of it, not out of doubt, but because stepping back into those woods would not be the same as before. This time he would not be following, he would be choosing. His hand brushed the inside of his coat, feeling the edge of the badge again, and he thought of the man on the road, the folded paper, the careful tone that carried no threat and yet promised consequence. And it became clear that silence alone would not hold what was coming. Not for long. Ethan stepped into the shade of the trees, the air cooler there, the ground softer under his boots, and the familiar stillness returned, not empty, but watchful, as if the land itself remembered him now. He did not take the same path as before, not exactly. Instead, he moved along the ridge line, higher ground, where a man could see without being seen, letting the terrain guide him rather than memory. Because whatever Clara had set in motion would not be confined to one clearing. After a quarter mile, he found it. Not the clearing, but the sign of movement, a set of tracks cutting across the slope, not careless, not rushed, but recent, the depth of the impression still holding shape, the direction leading away from the valley, not toward it. And that told him more than any words could. They were not waiting to be found. They were already moving beyond reach. Ethan followed the line for a short distance, just enough to understand the pattern, then stopped, crouching low, letting his fingers press into the soil beside the tracks, feeling the firmness, the intention, the absence of hesitation, and he realized this was not retreat. It was relocation, planned and precise. He rose slowly, his gaze lifting through the trees toward the horizon beyond. where the land opened into miles of nothing a man could cross in a day and vanish into by nightfall. And for the first time since morning, something like clarity settled in his chest, because whatever the rider had come looking for, it was already slipping beyond his reach. Ethan turned back then, not following the tracks further, not chasing something that was not meant to be caught. And as he stepped away, he reached into his coat and pulled the badge free, holding it in his hand once more, the metal dull in the filtered light, a symbol of a life that had not ended, only changed shape. He stood there for a moment, weighing it, not the object itself, but what it asked of him, and then, without ceremony, without hesitation, he slipped it beneath a loose stone at the base of a tree, pressing it into the earth where it would not be easily found, not by chance, not by someone passing through. He straightened, his hand empty now, lighter than it had been since the night before, and looked once more toward the direction the tracks had gone, not with regret, not with doubt, but with a quiet understanding that some truths were not meant to be carried in the open. And as he stepped back into the sunlight, leaving the woods behind again, Ethan Cole knew that when the rider returned, and he would, there would be nothing left to find except the same quiet land that had always been there, and the man standing in it, who had seen everything and chosen to leave it exactly where it belonged. By late afternoon, the heat had settled low across the valley, pressing down on the land in a way that slowed everything, even the wind, and Ethan Cole moved through it without rush, his pace steady, his mind quieter now than it had been since the night before, not because the questions were gone, but because the answers no longer demanded to be spoken. The town carried on as it always did, wagons rolling, voices rising and falling, the rhythm of ordinary life filling the space where something else had almost taken hold, and Ethan understood that most people would never notice the difference, because they were not looking for it. He stopped, near the edge of the main road, his gaze drifting toward the south where the rider had disappeared earlier, and for a moment there was nothing, just the shimmer of distance and the long stretch of land that swallowed men whole if they did not know how to read it. But then a shape formed again, small at first, growing clearer as it approached, the same rider, the same measured pace, returning sooner than expected. Ethan did not move, did not step away. He simply waited, because whatever was coming now had already been set in motion the moment that folded paper had been shown. The rider slowed as he reached the center of town, his eyes scanning again, sharper this time, more certain, and when they found Ethan, there was no hesitation. He turned his horse directly toward him and closed the distance without a word. "You have been out," the man said as he dismounted, his tone calm, but firmer than before, not asking, but confirming, and Ethan gave a slight nod, nothing more, because anything more would give shape to something that needed to remain without one. The rider studied him closely, then reached into his coat again, unfolding the paper fully this time, holding it where there could be no mistake, the face clear now, the lines more defined, and beneath it, a name that did not belong to the woman Ethan had met, not Clara Whitlock, but something else entirely, something older, something tied to the badge now hidden beneath stone and earth. "This person is not who she claims to be," the man said, his voice even, controlled, "and she has taken things that do not belong to her." And there was no need to explain what that meant. The words carried enough weight on their own. Ethan let his eyes rest on the paper for a brief moment, just long enough to acknowledge it, then lifted them back to the rider, his expression unchanged, his stance steady. "You are looking for someone who does not pass through here," he said, not denying, not confirming, just placing the truth where it could not be easily pulled apart. The rider's gaze sharpened at that, not anger, not frustration, but focus, the kind that narrowed the world down to a single point. "Everyone passes through. Somewhere," he replied, folding the paper again with careful precision, "and everyone leaves a mark." And for a second, the words hung between them, not as a threat, but as a certainty. Ethan felt the weight of that settle, not on his shoulders, but deeper, in the place where choices became part of a man rather than something he could set aside. And he understood that this was the moment where silence was no longer enough, not because he needed to speak, but because what he did not say would now be measured against what the other man believed. He took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make his next words carry without force. Some marks are not meant to be followed, he said, his voice low, steady, and there was no challenge in it, no defiance, just a line drawn in a way that could not be mistaken. The rider held his gaze for a long second, weighing the meaning behind the words, searching for something that might shift, might break, might give him what he needed. But Ethan did not move, did not look away, did not offer anything beyond what he had already placed between them. Finally, the man gave a small nod, not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement, and stepped back, his attention moving to the town around them as if recalculating something unseen. If she is here, he said quietly, almost to himself, she will not stay. And Ethan said nothing. Because that part, at least, was already true, the rider mounted his horse again, turning, slightly as if to leave. But his eyes lingered one last time on Ethan, not suspicious, not convinced, just aware. And then he rode on, heading north this time, away from the woods, away from the path that no longer held anything to find. Ethan remained where he stood, the town moving around him, the moment passing without spectacle, and as the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, he knew that what had been hidden was now beyond reach, not because it had been erased, but because it had been given the space to exist without being claimed, and that, more than anything, was the choice he had made. The town did not speak of the rider after he left, not because they had forgotten, but because nothing had happened that demanded remembering, and that was how places like this survived, by letting moments pass without giving them more weight than they asked for. But Ethan Cole knew that what had come through that road was not finished, it had only been redirected. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, the sun lowering slow across the valley, casting shadows that reached farther than the buildings themselves, and Ethan found himself walking without purpose, not toward anything, not away either, just moving through the spaces he had known for years as if seeing them for the first time. Every fence line, every worn path, every place where a man might stand and decide what kind of person he was going to be when it mattered. He stopped near the far edge of town where the land dipped slightly before rising again into open range. And from there, he could see the tree line in the distance, dark and still under the fading light, holding its silence the way it always had, giving nothing back to those who did not already understand it. A small movement caught his eye then, not from the woods, but from the road that cut along the ridge to the west. Two riders this time, not hurried, not searching, just passing through, their silhouettes steady against the sky. And Ethan watched them for a moment before realizing something that settled deep and certain in his chest. They were not following anything. They were heading somewhere else entirely, a different line, a different purpose, and that told him more than any words could have. Whatever trail had led that first man here had gone cold the moment Ethan chose to let it, not erased, not denied, just left where it belonged, beyond reach of those who would turn it into something it was never meant to become. The wind picked up slightly then, moving through the grass in long, quiet waves, and Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, letting it pass over him, carrying with it the last traces of something that had almost taken hold but never fully did. And when he opened them again, the land looked the same as it always had, wide, open, untouched by the decisions made within it. He reached into his coat pocket out of habit, his fingers brushing against empty fabric where the badge had once rested, and for a moment he felt the absence of it more than its presence had ever been, not as loss, but as release, like setting down something that had never truly belonged to him in the first place. The sun dipped lower, the light turning softer now, stretching across the valley in long, quiet lines that made everything seem farther away than it was. And Ethan stood there watching it, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything, just letting the moment settle the way it needed to. He thought of Clara then, not as the woman who had walked into town months ago, not as the name she had carried, but as the truth he had seen beneath it, the choice she had made to stand where others would have kept moving, to hold something together that could have easily been lost. And he understood that some lives were not meant to be explained, only protected by those who recognized them for what they were. A wagon passed behind him, the driver giving a casual nod that Ethan returned without thinking, the small, ordinary exchange grounding him again in the place he had always belonged, even as part of him remained somewhere beyond those trees. And as the last light slipped toward the horizon, Ethan Cole turned back toward town, his steps steady, his mind quiet, carrying nothing in his hands, nothing in his pockets, and yet more certain than he had ever been that the right thing did not always leave a mark where others could see it. Sometimes it simply meant knowing where to stop looking and having the strength to leave it there. The night settled gently over the valley, not as a curtain drawn, but as something earned, the kind of quiet that comes after a long day when the land itself seems to rest. And Ethan Cole sat alone on the edge of his porch, his hat resting beside him, his hands still, his gaze fixed on the dark line of trees that had not changed and never would. The town behind him had gone quiet in its own way, doors closed, lanterns dimmed, voices lowered to nothing more than distant murmurs, and for anyone else, it would have felt like the end of something, the closing of a chapter, but Ethan knew better, because some stories did not end. They simply moved beyond where others could follow. He leaned back slightly, the wood of the porch creaking under his weight, and let the silence settle around him, not empty, not hollow, but full of everything that had been said without words, every choice made without witness. He thought about the badge beneath the stone, not as something hidden, but as something returned, placed back into the ground where it could no longer be used to define a person who had chosen to become something else. And in that small act, he understood more than he had when he first held it in his hand, that identity was not something given. It was something carried, shaped, and sometimes, if necessary, left behind. A breeze moved through the trees then, soft and steady, carrying the faint scent of dust and distant smoke. And for a moment, Ethan closed his eyes, not to escape the world, but to feel it without needing to measure it, without needing to understand it. Beyond what it already was, somewhere far beyond the ridge, beyond the lines men drew on maps and called borders, Clara Whitlock no longer existed, not in the way the world would recognize. But that did not mean she was gone. It only meant she had stepped outside of what others expected her to be, and in doing so, had become something harder to find, and perhaps something more necessary than the name she left behind. Ethan opened his eyes again, his gaze steady, calm, and there was no doubt left in it. No question waiting to be answered. Only the quiet certainty that he had stood at a crossing and chosen the path that did not leave a trail for others to follow. He reached for his hat, turning it once in his hands before setting it back on his head. A simple motion, ordinary, but it marked something all the same. Not an ending, not a beginning, just a continuation of a life that would carry this moment without ever needing to speak of it. The stars had begun to fill the sky now, faint at first, then stronger, scattered across the darkness in a way that made the world feel both vast and contained at the same time. And Ethan watched them for a while, not searching for meaning, not asking for anything, just letting them be what they were. In the distance, the trees stood unmoved, holding their silence the way they always had, and beyond them, unseen and untouched, a different kind of order continued forward, not bound by towns or names, or the expectations of men who believed they understood the world because they could draw it on paper. Ethan Cole did not smile, did not speak. He simply sat there, breathing in the quiet, and when he finally rose and stepped back inside, closing the door behind him with a soft, final sound, there was no trace left of what had passed, no mark, no sign, nothing for anyone to follow. And that was how it was meant to be, because out here, the truest kind of justice did not come with noise or recognition. It came in silence, carried by those who understood that sometimes the right thing was not to act, not to reveal, not to claim, but to see clearly, choose carefully, and then walk away without ever looking back.